Welcome, Heather and Bret. It's been a pleasure to have you in Prague.
It's been a total pleasure to interact with you, Adam, and everyone at the Institute. We really appreciate it.
It's really been marvelous, and as you know, being in the Czech Republic has been blowing our mind to find a civilization as apparently functional as the Czech Republic is at this moment. I know that sounds strange if you live here, but in comparison to the rest of the Western world, you have something very good here. Protect it.
I want to start with a quotation that you have in the book by Charles Dickens, which says, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times, it was the age of wisdom, it was the age of foolishness. We had everything before us, we had nothing before us. It seems like we're experiencing this strange, almost paradoxical duality in the world right now, where in many respects things have never been as good as we have it right now, but also we have this increasing feeling of fragility, and it's almost, you know, people say that the time is pregnant with a crisis, and many people feel that doom is coming. And in your book, you do talk about how some of the aspects that made us so successful are actually now driving the crises that we're experiencing, and you talk about the phenomenon of hyper-novelty. Would you mind explaining what that is?
Sure. Human beings are, what's going to happen again? Human beings are the species with the most capability to change of any creature that has ever existed. In fact, our specialty is no specialty at all. We switch between niches regularly. A creature that has the same hardware to engage in hunting marine mammals also has the capacity to do intensive agriculture on steep hillsides. So our ability to change is unmatched, but the rate of technological change that we have produced is so fast that it outstrips our capacity to change. We can't keep up with it. And so we are always effectively a fish out of water. This is making us sick physically, psychologically, socially, and societally. And you're not imagining it. When you look around, things really are coming apart. But if I can address the paradox that you raised, it is the best of times and it's the worst of times. And we say in the book that when you see a paradox, that's nature's way of telling you, dig here. It's like an X on a treasure map, because there can be no real paradoxes. Every true story must reconcile. And in this case, you have terrible conditions which would be required for us to move to a new way of being that solved these problems. The fact that things are bad is actually necessitated if we are to find a way forward, which is not guaranteed that we can, but it would have to get this way in order for us to be motivated to move.
I would just add, you mentioned a fish out of water. And we are very much like a fish out of water. That's better. Let me just spend a moment talking about the title of the book. Am I on? Oh, there we go. So we are hunter-gatherers. We're hunter-gatherers 50,000 years ago, 100,000 years ago, and we haven't changed much. Individual populations have, of course, but for 200,000 years, we've had more or less the same anatomical and physiological reality on the planet. But what has changed is our software. And we are still, therefore, adapted in part to being hunter-gatherers, but we're also adapted to all the other parts of our history. So we called the book A Hunter-Gatherer's Guide to the 21st Century, but we could have called it A Fish's Guide to the 21st Century, because we're fish too. And there are parts of us that are still fishy in nature, and although we are literally fish out of water, for the most part, we're doing okay for ourselves, because it's been a long time since we were actually swimming in water as fish. We could have called it a mammal's guide to the 21st century, a primate's guide, a monkey's guide, an ape's guide. And we landed at a hunter-gatherer's guide, but we could have done more recent as well, an agriculturalist's guide, because those things that have changed for us since we developed agriculture 10, 12,000 years ago, several times across the planet independently, but all of us now in this room are in a lineage of agriculturalists, or a post-industrialist guide. So all of these pieces of our history are true for us, and they all bring to bear some slightly different piece of the puzzle with regard to how we can understand ourselves in this modern times, which, as Bret said, we are we are experiencing the hyper-novelty that we ourselves have created, and which is moving so fast that even we can't quite keep up.
You also use the concept sucker's folly with regards to how we actually react to what is happening, to the crisis. What is sucker's folly?
Sorry, we're having some audio issues. There is a basic problem with, you might call it the tyranny of the present over the future, which is that things that matter in the immediate count more because something may prevent you from reaching a point where something else that is more important, that is, has larger consequences, comes to dominate. And this is actually the reason that the human body fails as it grows old. We have a genome that is relatively small, which means that everything in it has to do multiple jobs. And what was discovered was that genes that have a positive effect early in life and a negative effect late in life tend to be favored very strongly by selection because of the disproportionate importance evolutionarily of what happens to you early. If the late life effects happen after you're already dead, then you got away with it. And so selection doesn't count it as negative. Or if most of your reproduction is already done, it counts much less than if that had happened to you early. So what this results in is something that an economist would call discounting. And that discounting is a fatal problem. Now, in the case of creatures like us, we have a perfect solution. It is incredible and ideal. And that is that you have children, and your children pick up that small fraction of what you know that's actually useful, and then they discard the rest, and they move forward in time, and the fact that your body will fail over time is irrelevant because the important part of what you are as a human being is carried on in them. Now, the problem is that this creates societally the same dynamic, which is that we have an economic system that will reward and spread any pattern that's profitable at the moment, even if the net effect of that process is negative over time. So we accumulate these properties in civilization, and our civilization is failing. This is the reason. It's the senescence of civilization is what we are witnessing. The problem is we don't have the same mechanism of producing an offspring civilization that will pick up that small fraction of what was good about our civilization and carry it forward. It's simply going to blink out with us. And that is effectively the pattern.
Talking about civilization, that brings me to the question of culture. Normally, I've read many books by biologists, and quite often what I encountered was that once you get into culture, that's where evolutionary thinking or biology stops. But that's not actually the approach that you're taking in the book. And also, you invoke the notion of Chesterton's Fence, that perhaps we should be a bit more careful about removing some long-standing cultural aspects before we actually get to know what they're actually doing. What's the logic between linking evolutionary theory to, or applying evolutionary theory to culture?
So Darwin famously identified evolution as what turns out to be probably the most important force, perhaps in the universe. And he did not identify a mechanism. He was unaware of Mendel's work, who was actually a contemporary. And he had some interesting guesses, but he didn't know. And at the point that Mendel discovered what became known as the gene and the idea of genetics, very quickly, evolutionary biologists, this nascent field, understood genes and genetics to be the mechanism of evolution. And this was a mistake. Genes, of course, are a mechanism of evolution, and they are the information by which we pass on information, by which we pass on things to our children. But many of us, all humans, apes, elephants, wolves, toothed whales like dolphins and orcas, also pass things on through the cultural layer. It is a mechanism of evolution, culture is, no less than the genes. It has some slightly different features. It doesn't take a reproductive event to transfer. It does tend to pass linearly, downstream vertically, but it can also pass horizontally. And so the fact that it does all of the same things but faster than genes says it has to be evolutionary. It absolutely is evolutionary. And it was just an error of people jumping to a conclusion that at the point that we found a solution, and this is the story, frankly, since probably of all humanity, but certainly since the Industrial Revolution, we have a problem. What could be the mechanism of this thing that we know is true? We find one thing that is true, and we decide that that is the only thing that is true. So culture is one of the other mechanisms of evolution, and it is the way that humans are utterly unique and able to have spread across the planet.
I would just add that there's something funny about the fact that we ever misunderstood culture as something other than a kind of biology. Because if you think about the degree to which human beings spend effort on things that we know are transmitted culturally, it is such a profound expense that were it not serving our genetic ends, the genes are in a perfect position to shut it down. They don't have to produce a culturally inhabitable brain. They could produce a brain that was like most of the creatures on Earth that doesn't absorb any culture whatsoever. Most creatures never meet their parents. There's no culture transmitted. So the fact that our brains are wired to pick up culture says with certainty that this must be a biologically favorable adaptive trait. And it is just an accident of history that we discovered that there was a adaptive logic to culture, that we said, oh, this is an analogy to Darwin's mechanism. It's like biology in some ways. That's nonsense. It's a type of biology. Culture is every bit as biological as genes, and it's every bit as adaptive. It just works slightly differently.
So far we've been talking about the sort of abstract framing of the book, but you go into very concrete topics and you give practical advice based on these principles. You talk about schooling, about health, about relationships and sex and so on. Sort of linking the previous question with this one, when it comes to culture, you often invoke the notion of the Chestertons Fence. And I don't know if many people, if all people actually know what that idea means. Could you perhaps explain it and give us some practical examples that you use in the book and in the more concrete chapters?
Sure. So G.K. Chesterton outlined what is effectively a corollary of the precautionary principle. And he uses a parable of two people walking who discover a fence that has no apparent use. And the argument leveled by one is that the fence should be taken out. There's no apparent reason that it is necessary. And the other person replies, no, you can't take it out until you tell me what it was doing here. Because you don't know if it's still doing its job until you know what its job was. And it may be that the fence has become useless, that the cattle that it was constraining are no longer on the land, or it may be that you just haven't seen why it's present, and if you remove it, you're going to reinvent whatever problem it solved. Now, we are in this position to an extraordinary extent. The degree to which any time we solve a problem really well, there's always an argument looking at whatever structure it is that solved it, that is just a nuisance, it's an unnecessary constraint on our behavior, and we will literally reinvent the same problems that our forefathers had already provided an elegant solution to. There are numerous examples of this, but I would say just look at your own lives and look at the lives of people 3 or 4 generations back and all of the things that we have dispensed with. You know, especially things in our religious traditions. There's a sense that has spread across the West. These are antiquated stories that we have enough science, we know that they are false, and what we don't know is all of the solutions that were buried in those stories, all of those traditions. You know, is fasting a mechanism for curing addictions? Is it a mechanism for generating a kind of willpower, an ability to endure suffering that it would allow you to escape from an addiction? We don't know. All we know is that the gods it was supposed to appease don't appear in our experiments. So there are, you know, we could spend the rest of the month naming examples nonstop because they're everywhere.
But I'll name 2 more. We talk also, we give examples using the Chestertons Fence starting point of other Chestertons whats. Chestertons religion, for instance. Chestertons Organs is one. We talk about a story which will sound fantastic, fantastically absurd to those of us in modern times in the 21st century, from about 100 years ago, when doctors in the United States became aware that the colon really didn't do anything at all, that is the large intestine. And so they started taking it out of perfectly healthy human bodies because it was just in the way. Now, this sounds absurd to us because the large intestine is now understood to do quite a number of things. Presumably, we don't have a complete idea of all the things that it does, but we are now so smart and so wise that we wouldn't do that. But what we have been doing is taking out people's appendixes and taking out people's tonsils. And those organs turn out also to have adaptive value that perhaps we had just missed. One more example, Chesterton's breast milk. We found a function for breast milk which is obvious, which is it's feeding the child. And at the point that we decided that that was all it did, much as we decided that the only thing religion was doing was allowing people to believe in God, for instance, we said, well, we can get around that. It's awfully messy. Some women have a hard time doing it. It's not very convenient. Why don't we create an external source of nutrition for the child and provide formula? Well, of course, breast milk turns out to be a communicator of far more than just nutrition. It is communicating immune information to the baby. It is communicating, perhaps, one of our past students had the hypothesis, and it is beginning to be borne out in the research, that it is helping to entrain the circadian rhythms of the baby, such that if you are breastfeeding your baby and co-sleeping with that baby, you are much more likely for both you, the mother, and the baby to be getting decent sleep. Whereas if when the baby wakes up in the middle of the night and the baby is either being fed formula or even breast milk that was expressed at a different time of day, that baby may be getting a signal that, hey, it's time to wake up, it's playtime, as opposed to it's the middle of the night and the food that I'm getting, it has the hormones in it that tell me that it's the middle of the night, and as soon as I get my nourishment, I'm going to go back to bed. So who knows what else we don't know about the value of breast milk, about the value of various organs, about the value of religion. All of these things we get rid of at our peril, and we have this hubris that imagines that right now, it's humans right now that have finally arrived. Like we got there. The people from 10 years ago, 100 years ago, 1,000 years ago, they were fools, but we got it now. And we don't have to be that wise to understand that the people 100 years from now, should we be so lucky as to have people here 100 years from now, will feel the same way about us.
One thing that I particularly liked about your book is that you use sophisticated scientific argument to explain what is going on, but then when you come to the conclusion, you actually derive pieces of wisdom that, for example, my grandmother would relate to. In other words, you're almost liberating some of the ideas that sounded old-fashioned, perhaps because of the sacris folio, because of the reductionism that you do criticize in the book.
Or if I may, Adam, perhaps because culture was adaptive all along.
Yep.
Right, and we got rid of it at our peril.
Well, exactly. And I want to come back because you just mentioned religion, and which again it is striking to me because I grew up on Richard Dawkins, big time evolutionary biologist who essentially uses evolutionary logic to reject religion, right? But you have this phrase that you're using in relation to religions that it may not be literally true, but it may not be. It is literally false, but metaphorically true. What does that mean?
If you think about what evolution must be doing for us, it does not make sense that evolution would cause us to find the truth and behave according to it. What it should do is it should find things that cause you to behave in an adaptive way, even about things that you don't know the truth about. And let me just give you one example. In the Old Testament, there is a prohibition. God makes it clear that he does not want people shitting in camp, right? That is a disgusting thing, and it is to be done outside of camp, right? Now, the idea that you should keep feces outside of camp is the reason you wouldn't do it is you don't want to anger this all-powerful being who is in a position to punish you. There's nothing in there about the idea that this may spread disease that could actually cause your entire lineage to suffer, might make them vulnerable to their enemies. So here you have a document that goes back literally millennia that gives you advice that will cause you to act as if you understand the germ theory of disease 2,000 years before anybody knows what a germ is. That is an amazing feat. Encoded in that document is a belief that causes you to act like someone who understands the germ theory of disease. The whole book is like that. Now, there will be scaffolding. There will be pieces that are not themselves functional. There will be other pieces that were true at one time. They were metaphorically true in the sense that if you behaved according to them at one time, it would give you an evolutionary advantage, and that's not true anymore. So what we are stuck with is the need to look at these documents and say some of these things have changed, some of them have not, and the fact that the stories may be literally false shouldn't change our behavior. We should still be acting in this way, and we have no way of detecting what's what. But the biggest obstacle to our figuring out where there is wisdom in there and where the wisdom is outdated is the belief that the entire structure is a mind virus, which is, of course, what Richard Dawkins has said about it, that it is, in fact, a parasite that is taking advantage of people. It is using people to transmit itself, just like a real virus. This couldn't possibly be true. And once we recognize that it is often very good to know the truth, but it is, from an evolutionary perspective, important that you behave as if you know the truth, even if you don't. And that's why we have so much metaphorical truth, even inside of science. And I guess the other point I would make is, if you look at the models that we use in science to teach new scientists how to do the job, there's a lot of things that are literally true. And then there are places where we actually don't really know what's going on, and we have a story that we pass between generations of scientists, something like our model of the electron, right? We know our model of the electron isn't true in a factual sense because it's self-contradictory. Is this an object? Is this a wave? Is it a cloud of probabilities? Right? We have to lean on different versions of the electron in order to know what to make of it in each different context. Those are metaphorically true stories. They are good enough to do science, and then they hold us back at some point. And there will be some later model that is closer to the literal truth. It will still have metaphorical truth in it, and that's just the nature of the thing. Over time, the degree of metaphor drops as we become more sophisticated in our understanding of the universe. But we should not imagine that we scientists are free of this metaphorical truth, because it is actually necessary to our work.
Let me just add one thing to that. I think the story that we all have in our heads about how we do things, especially how people do science, is if you're trying to get to point 10, you have to go linearly, 1, and then 2, and then 3, and then 4, and on. And you have to fully understand each of those points in that sequence. And what Bret is talking about, and how it is that we are applying this idea of literally false, metaphorically true to science, is saying, you know what? You can actually black box several of those points. And for some people saying, I actually don't know what's going on at step 4, but I know for sure that you get from 3 to 5 every single time, and therefore it doesn't matter. Like, some people will want to focus on what's going on at step 4, but if I want to focus on downstream of that, on step 8, if I can be sure that 3 always gets you to 5, even if I don't know what happens in between, that's okay. And so these metaphors that we use, which often we'll call black boxes, are okay. It's not giving up, and it's not bad science inherently, but it seems like it to the people who would argue, no, you have to know exactly what happens at every step, else you can't know anything.
Okay, I'd be able to talk about your book for ages. Yesterday we were supposed to be talking for 1 hour, and then we got chatting, and then I realized we're 2 hours in, and I haven't even exhausted all my questions. So there's plenty to discuss, and I would definitely encourage you to draw upon what's been said in your questions if you're interested. However, I do want to finish on a sort of how would I say it, almost a hopeful point that comes in the final chapter, because when you're reading the book, you do sometimes, I would say, get a sense of gloom, because it seems like we have lost our way in important ways that mark the different crises, even for example the democratic crisis or the mental health crisis that you do talk about. But in the final chapter, you do present a vision of how we could possibly amend some of the foolishness that we've been engaged in, that you call the fourth frontier. What is the fourth frontier, and what are the previous three, if there's a fourth one?
So I'll set up the previous three, and then Bret will talk about the fourth. When you say the word frontier to people, what they think of is land. They think of as geography, of going over the horizon and discovering a place that no humans have ever been in before, and making it yours. That's the first frontier by our numerology, the geographic frontier. The second type of frontier, the second frontier, is one that humans are the best in the world at, although we are not the only ones, which is a technological frontier, in which we make something where there was not anything before. So we learn how to engage in agriculture, and we bring forth far more nutrients from the land in a place that we can find it than we had before. And once we've done that in the bottomlands, we look up slope and we say, I bet we could terrace those hillsides, and we could plant things there too, and not have all the water and the nutrients run off the hills. That is a technological frontier, the second frontier. Both of those are legitimate and wonderful. We're out of number one. There's no more geographic frontier to discover on this planet, and there are no other planets looming large in our future. And technological frontiers are impossible to predict. They keep coming. But we can't predict when they will come, and the fact is that resources are finite. The third type of frontier is illegitimate, and it has been widely used throughout history. We call it a transfer of resource frontier. It's theft. It's when people move into another landscape that is already inhabited by other people, and they take what's there. They either kill the people or they enslave them, and they make that land theirs. So we can't ever encourage the third type of frontier in humanity ever. The first type of frontier we're out of, and the second type of frontier is wonderful but unreliable. So what do we have left?
So when we talk about frontiers, we're talking about growth. And that term is unfortunately hampered by the fact that we all come by it first in economic terms, but it's not fundamentally economic. All creatures are in search of growth, and the way you can detect that a creature has found a growth opportunity is that its population begins to rise. Populations are stable, they find a frontier, and then individuals more than replace themselves in future generations until they get to a place where the new opportunity is full and there's no more growth. And if you think about it, what that means is that to any creature, the times in which you have discovered a frontier are the good times, because there's literally more than enough to go around, and what it takes to get it is just simply work. So an abundant time is what we want, but it means that we, like all the other creatures, but with special tools, are addicted to growth, not because it's always possible to find it, but because it is highly desirable if we can. Evolutionarily, growth is success, and so we pursue it. But as addicts of growth, when that second frontier is no longer available to us, when there's not a technological way to make more of what we already have, then that addiction causes us to look for it on that third frontier. And this is the stuff of history. All of the tragedies of history are driven by people effectively making up excuses to steal resources that belong to someone else, enlarging their slice of the pie as they shrink other slices and shrink the net size of the pie completely. So the question is, if we are to avoid the end of growth producing increasing lineage against lineage violence, where we displace each other from resources that we have found, we need something that satisfies the desire for growth that we growth addicts have. So it's going to have to feel like growth if it's going to work. The fourth frontier is the idea that we can't blueprint it, we don't know enough to design it, but we do know enough to navigate in the direction of a steady state in which the individuals feel as if they have growth, because the experience is like that of our ancestors who had happened onto a frontier. What's that like? Well, it's a situation in which your needs are taken care of and you are actually liberated to pursue meaning of some kind or another, whether that's building things that you find rewarding, whether it's searching for a deeper understanding, whatever kind of innovation you're into, you would be liberated to do it. And I know that this sounds utopian. It can't be. Utopia is a terrible idea. It has resulted in a tremendous amount of tragedy. So this has to be a practical plan, and it would need to be a steady state that delivered the feeling of growth to people in the same way that your climate control system in your house delivers constant spring temperatures, even though outside the temperature varies widely from winter to summer. So you have to have something that would provide effectively a source of energy with which we could create the feeling, the sensation of growth and the liberation that comes from growth without needing to find external sources. And I will point out that in the book, we make the argument that the structures that were left behind by the Maya are suggestive of what this mechanism would look like. And these structures, I advise you, if you ever have the chance to travel in Maya country, it is well worth looking at what they accomplished. It was a tremendous civilization. In many ways, they were like the Greeks of the New World. And their temples, we all know, we've seen these pictures of temples, pyramids sticking out of the jungle. But these pyramids actually don't really tell the story. Below those pyramids are vast temple complexes. This was public space that was augmented. And the temples, when archaeologists have looked into them, they're not structures that were planned and then built. They were actually structures that grew over time. So the longer a city-state of the Maya existed in a location, the grander and more elaborate these structures became. And what that suggests is that there is a mechanism in which this very successful, frankly very wise culture that measured time in periods of 400 years, called the Baktun, this culture that lasted for 3,000 years, which is an amazing feat, that they were taking a large fraction of the production that they were able to accomplish, farming very fragile soils, and they were putting that production into public works. And those public works, the key thing about them is that in a year when the crops underperform, you don't have to add to the temples. There's no cost. And by backing off those public works, what you don't get in those years that should produce austerity is starvation, because the population has been held to a lower rate of growth by virtue of the fact that you invested a lot of the surplus in these public monuments. So I don't know what that would look like for our civilization, but the idea that there is a way that we could invest in ourselves over time such that the fluctuations which are inevitable don't reach the individuals, the people. It feels like springtime all the time. That would be the mechanism.
Well, thank you very much. I hope this has given you some food for thought, and you can already start thinking about your questions. But before we get to them, I would like to invite to the stage Karel Janicek, who will say a few words, and then we'll get the champagne ready and baptize the book.
Oh, good afternoon. I'm not prepared to say a few words. I just saw that I'm going to baptize the book. But let me just thank so much to the great people, the authors, for their amazing work and for their amazing courage that we are helping us, the whole world, actually, with spreading objective and truthful knowledge and other important human values. So let me start baptizing.
So yeah, this is a tradition that we do in the Czech Republic. I don't know why we're doing it, but it's a Chestertons book baptism. Maybe there's some important reason that we're missing. Okay.
What do you want from us, Adam?
Hold the book, and Karen will pop the champagne, baptize it, the rest goes into glasses, and we'll toast it.
You could probably ship.
No. We'll keep the book. Oh yeah. So cheers to the book. Cheers to the
Okay, I thereby declare the book baptized, and now we have time for questions. We have a mobile microphone, so please raise your hand if you have one. There's already a gentleman over there, and one of my colleagues will get to you shortly.
This might have already been asked, but you might have already answered it. But what motivated you to write the book?
We actually have a former student here with us today. I don't know if she wants to be identified, so I'm not going to unless she wants to raise her hand. Okay. Hey, Raven. Very near the end of our tenure teaching. But Raven was one of the many amazing students that we had when we were teaching. We were college professors for 14, 15 years at the Evergreen State College, which was a really unusual place. It was a public liberal arts college that had full-time programs where the faculty, if they cared to, could really get to know students and dig deep and had complete freedom to teach whatever we wanted, however we wanted. And we took students into the field, we took students like Raven to the Amazon, to the Galapagos, all sorts of places. And some of what we were teaching was very much what is in this book. And at some point, a few years into teaching at Evergreen, we started to be asked. We taught, I taught programs, Bret taught programs, sometimes we taught them together, usually we taught them separately. But we had students come to us and say, this is great. This is really transforming how I'm understanding who I am, what I am, how I should move around the earth and do the best work that I can here. But my roommate, my girlfriend, my husband, my mother is listening to me talk, and it sounds like gobbledygook. Like I don't know how to communicate it. Would you please write this down? So we were talking for a long time. I remember in an anatomy lab talking to students about it in, I think, 2012. About this book, and we already had the title, although I understand the title may not be as good as we thought it was. But then our college blew up on us, and we found ourselves still wanting to write the book, and now with enough of a possible audience to actually be able to have it reach people.
No.
All right. Okay.
Yeah.
Gentleman over there.
Thank you. So, first of all, thank you so much for everything you have been doing, for standing up for yourselves, for the podcasts, for everything. Keep up the good work, please. And
thank you.
My question is, do you have still optimism somewhere in there? You mentioned the evolution, the culture kind of a way. Those in power, those with funds, it's never been easier for them to change what people are thinking, and I don't really think it's headed a great way. So, is there some optimism?
Thank you for that, by the way. Let me just be candid with you. I think the darkest I have ever felt is the period between October 7th and our first day in the Czech Republic. And the reason that that is the darkest I have ever felt is that it became clear on October 7th that we did not have the power to stop the world from being dragged back into lineage against lineage violence. And the problem is not only that the world of lineage against lineage violence is a terrifying and awful world in which tragedies are a regular feature, but that we can't survive it with the weapons that we have at our disposal. So it is, in some sense, I think, the end of humanity if that is where we're headed. Upon arriving in the Czech Republic, what we've discovered is that the West, for whatever reason, and we've been discussing it ever since we got here, for whatever reason, some version of it seems to still be functioning here. There are no institutions in the US that work, literally none above the tiniest size. They don't work. They've all been captured. They've all been turned to a paradoxical purpose that is not public-spirited. But the discovery that somewhere there are people who are still living by the basic agreement not to rig civilization in their own favor means that actually there's something from which to reboot this idea. So, as I said at the beginning, times would have to get very dark in order for us to move onto what we would evolutionarily say is a higher peak. You have to go through an adaptive valley. There are no guarantees that you get through it, but you can't get there without going through it. So it has to be dark times. We are there. But the idea that there is, you know, as the West is obviously coming apart at the seams, that there is the possibility of a new West. And in fact, remember the first thing I said. Civilization does not have a plan like having children that pick up that fraction of what you understand that's actually useful and moving forward in time with it. But there is a way that this could be the case. In other words, if we can remember what parts of the West actually functioned, and we can say what would be necessary to create a new global West, that would be, you know, the birth of a civilization that would stand a chance of actually surviving another several hundred years. So I have hope, but I'm glad you didn't ask me that last week.
Why though? Between October 7th and our arrival in Prague, you said, were your darkest times. So what changed as we arrived?
Well, it was just the discovery that there was, you know, I'm sure it's here. I'm sure there's insanity here. I'm sure there's anti-Semitism here. But let's be real with each other. We almost didn't get on the plane to come here because things have become so dire that even the idea of traveling to Europe, going to London, these things are now a very different question than they once were. So the idea that the world has become so small that we can't leave home, that there are people now literally who are becoming comfortable with the idea that we do not deserve to live because of who our ancestors are, that would be now out in the open, is a very, it's a dire turn of events, and I guess because I've been thinking about that question for decades, to see it happen is both jarring and not a surprise. This was, the end of growth was going to produce this transition. So seeing it happen in my lifetime was not a happy thing, but interesting that staring into the darkness of that then led, really by accident, this has been on the calendar for quite some time, to the discovery that there was hope where I wasn't expecting to see it. So that's why that period was special.
Okay. We've got a question, right, and then the gentleman in the front.
Děkuji. Já radši budu mluvit česky, protože lépe sformuluji myšlenky. Ta kniha je zajímavá už jenom tím názvem pro mě, protože si představuju, že lovci a sběrači to měli prostě těžký. A zároveň...
Možná já půjdu kousek po kousku. The book is interesting only by title only, because he imagines that the life of hunter-gatherers was quite difficult.
Ale zároveň tím, že měli nesrovnatelně těžší život, se toho hodně naučili. A já jsem velký fanda archeologie a vlastně mám takový pocit, že ti lidi byli mnohem schopnější, než jako my si dokážeme představit.
Okay, but since the life was so difficult for the hunter-gatherers, that also meant that they were forced to learn great many things on the go. And you're a fan of addictology?
Archaeology.
Oh, archaeology. Oh, archaeology. Yeah. Sorry, different field.
Yeah. Ale vlastně si představuju, že prostě v té době bylo hodně těžký být jako v něčím specializovaný, že vlastně čím těžší člověk život má, tím menší si může dovolit jako mít specializaci. A přiznám se, že trošku sebestředně o sobě uvažuji v tomhle termínu. A přiznám se, že vlastně netuším, jak vlastně člověk, který má takovýhle jako vnitřní nastavení, vůbec může fungovat ve světě, který se zaměřuje na specializace. A vlastně bych tam rád našel ten návod jako na ten paradox.
All right. So, given that the life was so difficult for the hunter-gatherers and they had to learn a great many things, that meant that they essentially couldn't be specialists. And as a person who recognizes specialization, sorry, I lost the last bit. What was the last bit?
Jakože, protože jsem si sám jako to sebe představoval jako v té situaci jako někoho, kdo toho hodně přežil, tak a zároveň jako člověk, který se už vlastně díky tomu těžko může v něčem jako specializovat, tak jsem si jako říkal, jestli tam v té knize najdu jako odpověď na tenhle paradox, že prostě v dnešní době jako je vlastně vyzdvihovná specializace nad jako univerzalitou.
Okay. That makes sense, and I think that's actually something that is discussed in the book. Just as a heads up. So the question is, what role does specialization play, or should play, in the general society, given that perhaps some of the advice that we would give hunter-gatherers would be more generalistic? How do you square the paradox between the need for specialization in modern society with the need for generalism also? I'm probably butchering the question, but yeah, something along those lines. Is that okay? Yeah.
So I used to have a thing that I used to say to students, which was, answer the question I should have asked you rather than the one I did ask you. And I used to say this because it was often the case that I didn't know what I was trying to evoke. I knew what neighborhood I was in, but the student had to do some work to figure out what was there, and often they would have really important things to say if they had that liberty. So I'm going to answer the question I think you're shooting for here. But first, I want to point out that this idea that the hunter-gatherers had it rough is both certainly true, because virtually every ancestor you ever had in the hunting and gathering period would have had not enough to eat. It doesn't mean that in every season they would have had not enough to eat. It would have been constant boom and bust, but there would in general have been not enough, and that is a frightening prospect to us moderns who have plenty to eat. On the other hand, hunter-gatherers had something, and we live in a way that to them would seem like hell. And the reason for this is because if you are in the environment that your ancestors understood well, then the world is a very intuitive place. It may be full of predators that can kill you, but you understand where you are, and you are not constantly faced with puzzles you can't solve. You may succeed, you may fail, but you are at one with your environment by virtue of having a program that is ideally matched to it through the process of selection. What we have done to our world is we have created a non-stop series of puzzles that mean nothing, and we don't have the tools to answer them. If you look at the ingredients on the box of whatever you're looking at the supermarket, you do not have the ability to understand whether the things in the box are a good idea for you to eat or not, right? It takes more power than you've got to answer the question, and so you are left with your conscious mind constantly stumbling over puzzles to which there is no solution, and that is not a fortunate way to live. So in some ways, they had it much easier than we did. And if we were to fix the world, what it would look like is a place in which childhood created the program so that your adult life could be lived in that intuitive state where the world that you encountered was a good match for you. And what that would do is it would leave your conscious mind free to engage puzzles that are worthy of it. Wasting your conscious mind on the ingredients on a box of stuff made in some factory you'll never see is not a good use of your conscious mind. Your conscious mind is an incredible gift. It is a computer capable of generating true insight, compassion, beauty, and to occupy it with mundane things is such a tragedy. So a world in which childhood creates an adult that is fit to the world around them so their conscious mind can be used for true meaning making and things that are worthy of a human being, that would have to be the objective. But don't leap to the idea that the hunter-gatherer life was so rough, because I have a feeling if you could teleport into their existence, tough as it was, you'd think, actually this feels pretty good.
I want to add something. We talk in the book about humans being effectively a generalist platform, which is rare. It's rare among organisms. There are a few examples of species that actually roam widely across many different kinds of landscapes: mountain lions, crows, gulls. But they are the exceptions, and we are by far the greatest exception. So we are generalists at the species level, but most of us are in fact specialists. And there is certainly value in specialization, but I would say two things. One, it is best if any individual can be specialist in more than one thing, can know at least 2, maybe 3 domains in which they really have depth, so that they can compare between domains and know to what degree the knowledge that they have that they think might actually generalize, because if it's true in 2 distinct domains, then they can take those lessons more widely. And this is related to something we used to do in our programs, including at least one of the ones that Raven was in with us. We used to have our students, because we had them full time, so we had 40 hours of their time every week to play with. And so one of the projects we would give them was called Learn a Skill. We'd say, we have a list of things that we want you to work on learning, and you're going to spend X number of hours every week, and at 5 weeks into the quarter, you're going to report out on where you are, but mostly you're going to talk about what the process is, like whether or not you've actually spent the time, and if not, how you talked yourself out of it. And then at the end of 10 weeks, you're not going to be a musician if you didn't start out as a musician. You're not going to be a carpenter if you didn't start out as a carpenter. But if you took on the skill of carpentry or of learning to play the guitar, you should be someplace new that you weren't at week 0, and you will know something about the process of learning. That is the thing. We want to get you on the slope again to learning how to learn for yourself. And so the one constraint, the major constraint that we put on the skills that we asked students to try to learn, which again, there's no way that you can possibly learn an in-depth skill in the amount of time we had. We wanted to get them on the slope, was that it had to be something for which there was unavoidable, objective feedback in the physical world, where you can't say, I succeeded, and have the audience say, yeah, you succeeded, and have some people walk away going, that wasn't success, and there's no objective way to assess, right? So if you're trying to learn how to do carpentry, or play the guitar, or even bake cakes, which seems like it's more into subjective territory, but there's chemistry there, and either it rose or it didn't, right? If you have skills where there's physical feedback from the world that is objective, then you really know that you know something, and you can ask the universe, did I get that right, or did I not get that right? And that, I think, is the path towards science.
All right, before we get to the next question, I just have a quick announcement that I need to segue into. The hunter-gatherers definitely had to solve the problem of scarcity, and as it turns out, we have a shortage of glasses here. So I would just ask you to hold on to your glass and then refill it accordingly. And I would give the word to the gentleman in the front row.
Hello. The short intro already sparked a lot of links to ideas of others. Like, for example, when you were talking about the problem of naively undoing the solutions of our ancestors, it really reminded me Thomas Sowell and his description of the constraint vision, where he says there are mostly trade-offs, not as much as solutions. And perhaps when we forgot that those pros and cons are linked, we are bound to make naive mistakes. But my actual question will be more towards the proposal, which I'm not sure I understand that well, because I think you said that you want to find something instead of growth and propose something which I interpreted as stability, which you describe this idea that you get rid of the excess so that you have more stable society, but this does not seem to me as something that could be used instead of growth for the feeling of fulfillment. In that case, I would maybe instead propose something like achievement, because I think what growth seems to be to human psychologically is some kind of achievement, and what is considered achievement must be related to the individual's or the society's values. So maybe it's about re-evaluating what we are valuing, what we consider to be achievement instead of this. And there is one problem that I would see with this idea of focusing on stability, and that is that we could potentially diminish our ability to adapt to sudden change when we are too comfortable in some stable life too much. Thank you.
Okay, I think I've got your question. I must have conveyed it incorrectly. It's not that the public works that we are describing are the substitute for growth. They are the solution to a different problem. If you imagine for the Maya, if you look at every year agriculturally, half of those years will be overproductive relative to the average. In each of those years, if you did not invest the surplus somewhere, what would happen is there would be a tendency for the population to go up a little bit. If you have 10 surplus years in a row, which is not unlikely, you can have periods in which every year was better than average, and you keep having the population grow, you're setting yourself up for disaster, because what happens is when you have 10 years of underperforming crops, suddenly you have not enough food for the number of mouths that you have. And what that causes is people to fission and to fight each other. So if what you did is you took all of the surplus and you don't throw it out, but you invest it in things that actually make the society robust and cohesive, and to your point, liberate individuals to do things that are truly useful. In other words, you invest deeply in the future. For us, that would look like things like basic research, right? Why are you studying that? Well, we don't know. Most of the things that we do are downstream of research programs that had no idea what they were going to deliver to us. So the idea of something that immunizes us from the boom and bust without the boom and bust is real. If you dream of preventing it from happening, then you're never going to get there. If you figure out a way to anticipate it and to absorb it such that what it does is it makes you stronger every time you have a surplus, and that gives you the ability to simply not invest in that mechanism in a bad year with nobody starving, everybody continuing to do the productive work as if they were living under a period of growth. Effectively, what you're doing is you are flattening out that oscillation, and so the society can be much more collaborative and will inherently tend in that direction. I see you have a follow-up. Go ahead.
So if I do understand, maybe we are doing similar thing, but in the same time opposite thing when we are using things like Federal Reserve, where instead of like getting rid of excess, we are filling the parts when we have the bust with fake
growth.
Fake growth,
right.
Yeah.
Well, I would say the more you look at what we are actually doing, you might be tempted to look at a major city and say, well, we're doing what the Maya are doing. We're building our temples. They are office buildings. Nope. We are doing the inverse. We have what I would call the throughput society, where we literally define our economic health in terms of the amount of stuff being sold, which is as dumb as defining the utility of a light bulb based on how much energy it burns rather than how much light it puts out, right? So, you know, we say in the book that if you invent a refrigerator that works just as well as your current refrigerator but lasts 10 times as long, it causes a dip in growth, which is registered as a failure, not a success, right? That is a broken society that functions that way. And so we would have to fix this in order to make it work. But on the other hand, I will tell you, and back to the question of hope and what's there, we're in trouble. But if we do decide, hey, we're going to rally and get out of this, what that means is that suddenly you have a world in which there is a tremendous amount to do, right? Everybody who has a skill or insight is immediately faced with a world full of meaning and purpose, and that will be a very different place than one in which we are all just doom scrolling and commenting.
All right. The lady in the middle.
Hello. I'd like to thank you as well for all the work you've been doing. It's been getting me through boring days of COVID for sure, on the long walks, listening to long-form podcasts. My question is, as we all, I guess, know that fish is not aware of the water, have you had a chance to have a brief analysis of what, in your opinion, is working here in our society, on what we should possibly double down on and which way we should not take, as opposed to the West-West? Because, for instance, we talked about religion and how it installs certain rules and guidelines that help us. But, for instance, here, Czech Republic is notoriously atheistic, so somehow we still make it work. So what do you think it's helping us?
Well, we've been wrestling with this question since we discovered that things were a bit different here. And I will tell you that I have a feeling what I'm about to say is metaphorically true, okay? You have a society here, and we have used this analogy actually in talking to various people, including Adam, about what might be going on of the fish that isn't aware of the water because it's the water they swim in. The story that is metaphorically true is that the Czech Republic was trapped behind the Iron Curtain. And while being trapped behind the Iron Curtain was certainly unfortunate, it did mean that some of the processes that seem to have corrupted the West-West they're at least newer, their influence. They've had less time to be corrosive. So capitalism travels very well with the freedoms of the West, but they are not the same system. The economic system is distinct, and we have done a very poor job in the West-West of tempering the excesses that come from it. And I would say it this way. Markets are the best tool we have ever devised for figuring out how to accomplish things. There's nothing that beats them because they are evolutionary. They are a terrible tool for telling you what to accomplish. So the way it would work if we were enlightened is we would tell the market what question we wanted to answer, and then we would listen to what it says about how you accomplish the job. But we wouldn't let it tell us how to be. The way we use markets, we ask them both things, and they explore every defect of character that we have, and it spits out a profit. And even though we can see the stuff isn't good for us, it takes over. And this is what has captured our institutions. So at the metaphorically true level, we suspect that something about being isolated from those forces for so long preserved a contact with the fundamental values which are at the core of what the West is in a better state. And we have an analogy for this. If you look at the music of Cuba, the music of Cuba withstood the destructive force that the music industry inflicted on all of the other musical traditions of Latin America. Right? It basically turned Cuba into a kind of time capsule. Now, this isn't perfectly true, but you can still find a very vibrant musical tradition there because there was a time out for Cuba, musically speaking. And something like that may have happened here. And we've also been thinking about the contrast with Hungary, right? Hungary also appears to be an exception to these rules, but we know exactly why it's exceptional, right? It has taken up a kind of lineage level thinking in which it has started to embrace an us against them mentality. And so really, in some ways, the contrast between these two societies describes the choice that we all have. Which way are we going to go? And I hope that conversation will start. I really do think, even if there's a degree of literal falseness there, there's enough truth that it is worth pursuing that question.
Good. Two gentlemen over there.
First of all, I would like to thank you for your voice of truth and courage during these last years. I'm following your work for years, so during your academic times and during the COVID pandemics. Thank you very much from the bottom of my heart for your scientific courage. I'll answer your question about Czech Republic and Prague. We are actually a hobbit town, right? So we do have some courageous hobbits here, and as we know, they have defeated Sauron, right? So we have been isolated, just like you said, during the Iron Curtain, and the West-West stuff is coming here with a certain delay. So let's hopefully it will not get its full claws here. My question is, what can we do on individual level and on, let's say, both live and online, and let's say community level to make things better? Because it seems the world is spinning out of its wheels. So we had Black Lives Matter, we had COVID crisis, we have war brewing in various parts of the world, we have the woke culture. So what can we do on individual level, both live and online, and community level? Thank you.
The sign-off that I give on Dark Horse is a good start, which is be good to the ones you love, eat good food, and get outside. Okay? Be good to everyone, but if you have to choose, be good to the ones you love, right? Eat good food, which means don't spend your time, don't spin your wheels looking at the ingredients on the boxes at the supermarket. As much as you can, source your food from where it grows. Grow it yourself or know your farmers, and spend more of your time thinking about what you put in your body. And get outside. And what all are the advantages of being outside? We don't know. But we know some of them. Right? We can start with synthesized vitamin D. You can't anymore right now. It's going to be months before you can synthesize vitamin D out here at this particular latitude. But you can still get it other ways, and there's still advantages to being outside. From the reductionist, the near infrared radiation is still coming off that sun, and just the difference in wind and temperature and rain that comes down, and your body has to think, your body has to respond, and you have to think, oh, this is not completely controlled. I am not in complete control. I don't have complete certainty about what's going to happen next. Every single one of those things that we expose ourselves to helps us become not just stronger, but more anti-fragile. And in terms of the individual level response, that's not a complete answer, but it's a pretty good start.
So in the book, we outline a model. I'll give you just the barest version of it here. The natural order for people is that you employ the wisdom of your ancestors until it's no longer useful because either something has changed in time or you've moved in space till it's no longer relevant. And the thing that you do then is you gather around a campfire. You gather around a campfire because your eyes aren't built to work at night, and so you'd be a hazard to yourself. And what you're better off doing is pooling your insight with others of your kind. We have this miracle of language that allows us to exchange abstract ideas with precision between our minds, and that allows us to parallel process problems. This is what consciousness is for. We think of consciousness as an individual phenomenon. That's an error. Consciousness will certainly have evolved because of its collective utility, and to the extent that we are individually conscious, that's a secondary effect, which we see as primary because we feel it more directly. But the thing that we are to do is to recognize that we have come to the end of our ancestral wisdom's ability to keep us safe and to move us forward. We are built for this. When you find yourself in that state, you pool your insight, you pool your observations, you parallel process the question, you present prototype answers, hypotheses, proposals, and then you You pressure test them. That's the natural stuff of being human when you face a novel hazard. Now, the problem for us is that we simultaneously have the greatest tools that any generation has ever had for doing this, even at global scale. We can have a campfire, and we do have the tools. That's what social media should be for. The problem is those tools were built by this capitalistic process that has turned them against the public interest. The fact that the very platforms on which we discuss things have an opinion on what we should conclude is a hazard to our ability to have that discussion. So I would say the first thing that we as individuals can do is we can demand a space where we can talk about our future because that is our right. And then we can employ this tool, which is the greatest gift that we have been given by our ancestry, to get ourselves out of this fix. We will not, by far, not be the first generation to face dire times and to figure our way out of it through human insight. But we have the tools, we just don't have them organized in the correct way. The answer is we should apply them at this new scale, and we should get ourselves out of this pickle, because it would be a terrible shame to waste the opportunity that we have.
Let me just add that Heather and Bret definitely practice what they preach, because on Sunday we went for a swim in the Vltava River, and we certainly got some useful feedback from there.
So one tactic that I noticed taking place on those social media platforms is people arguing from authority and then using sort of labels to stigmatize those that would question authority and dismiss their arguments out of hand without having to engage the ideas. It strikes me that equipping youth with the tools to see through this tactic and to think from first principles and to then articulate those ideas in the face of stigma is perhaps one of the more, if not the most important skill set that I can think of as a middle school teacher to try to bestow upon my students. I'm wondering if you have any curricular resources or any particular strategies that you've employed as educators yourselves that could scale up, or even, you know, at a small scale at the individual level, that could potentially be employed.
Well, Bret asked me if I had anything, and I said no, but I took the mic anyway. One of the things that is utterly different about social media platforms than actual education, of course, is that there's no accountability. And the thing that makes education effective and amazing is knowing, having everyone in the room know each other a little bit at least, and therefore having accountability. You all have a little bit of shared fate, right? If you're in a classroom together and you know you're going to be in a classroom together for the rest of the year, it behooves all of you to do what is right for all of you. And not all classrooms cohere, but it is not that hard, although middle school has got to be the hardest age group to do it in, to get a group of people to understand that actually we all win if we all hold each other's feet to the fire, and we don't let bad arguments sit because we want to be nice to people, but we also don't disrespect, and we do not conflate I disagree with you with I dislike you as a person. Your arguments, the things that come out of your mouth, and who you are totally different entities. And it's almost impossible to do this in social media space, in part because of the amount of anonymity, and in part just because of the scale. And I think it would be solvable with some of the same tools if there was just the scale problem, but the idea of curricular solutions to the problem of social media, given anonymity, I don't know. But Bret does.
Well, I take it you're talking about an actual classroom in your case. Is that right?
Yeah. It doesn't need to be particularly focused on social media. I think that sort of stigmatized and dismissed tactic is used in meetings with school administrators.
So I'm a little stuck here because I think I know the exact answer to your question. I would even say it was something I specialized in, but the answer is going to sound preposterous and very possibly make me sound like a bad person. So I would ask for a little leeway in my describing this. But the problem that you point to is a terrible one, right? The idea that we are training children to defer to authority, the fact that virtually everything we know is dependent on a kind of authority, and people don't even realize how far they've gotten from the ability to establish things for themselves. They don't realize to what extent they have become basically a broadcaster of the authorities that they have been told are accurate. So as an educator, it is profoundly important that you break that terrible habit, right? You're literally saving their minds if you can do it. So it is important that you use whatever tools are necessary. But the tools are going to involve, how can I say this gently? You delicately punishing them for appealing to authority and rewarding them for thinking for themselves. And the way you do this, first of all, you have to establish with them that you are very much on their side. They have to know that you care about them, so that when you do this, they understand that you're not hostile to them, that you are actually doing your job. You're doing this on behalf of their future selves. And I would say the tools are strange ones. You know, use humor. But when I was in the classroom, and it was a college classroom, it was not younger kids, so the leeway was a bit more. But if I detected that somebody was trying to tell me what I wanted to hear because I was the authority that was in charge of whether or not they got a good evaluation at the end of the quarter, then I would use that, right? I would spot that they were doing it, and then I would ask them questions, and I would lead them in some direction that I knew wasn't true, and I would lead them to some conclusion, and then I would ask them to defend it. And they couldn't, right? Because they were trying to please me, not trying to figure out what was true. And then the opposite process kicks in when somebody is thinking for themselves, right? And I would challenge that person, and I would let them know that somehow this wasn't making me happy, and they would have to become strong, and they would have to keep going because they knew there was something right down that road. And then when they would get to that really crystal clear answer, I would reward them for it. And they would realize, oh, the important thing was that I kept going at the point it didn't feel very comfortable. So if you had people who had had that experience somewhere along the line, then when this went down online, people would be much more inclined to stick to the principles that they knew were true for some fundamental reason rather than just because some authority told them of that. So I guess the short answer is think outside the box, let them know you care, use humor, make sure that everybody knows that you're doing it for them, right? And then you'd be surprised how much room you have to teach that lesson. But you've spotted the right one. Nothing's more important.
Okay. Oh.
Hi. I had to ask one question, of course. I just want to say it is such a delightful surprise that our paths are crossing in this amazing city. And I agree with everything that you all have said about being in Prague. It's been so refreshing coming from the US and just being like, wow, this place is intellectually vibrant and beautiful. So it's really been a delight to be here. I want to ask a question about secession. So with all due respect to the people that this implicates, the silent generation and the baby boomers, what I'm seeing is that as we don't have, life extension that will provide them with the resources to continue to live forever, that these people will inevitably pass away, and that this will cause a power transfer within society. I know particularly in the US, this means that certain faces that have been very familiar my whole life, Joe Biden, Nancy Pelosi, these certain figures, will no longer be part of our political conversation. Right now, we're not yet at that place where this transfer has occurred. And so what I'm seeing is that where there's this like a little bit of time almost to anticipate and to prepare for this transition. Is there anything that you would say about this? And, for me, I've mostly been politically alienated from my adult life. Are there political opportunities? Are there things that for for those of us who are looking to take on positions of leadership to look out for in this transition that we can anticipate?
Well, I'm afraid, unfortunately, by the way, this is the second time today I've been asked about secession. So it's that kind of day. But unfortunately, the model that we have, we don't know how much power there is left in it. And I don't know how this will land on your ears, but Donald Trump did us one very big favor. He demonstrated that actually there was enough potential left in our electoral system for something that was not planned to happen. So when I look at Robert Kennedy's campaign, I know, if Donald Trump had not achieved what he achieved, I wouldn't know whether it was even possible for Robert Kennedy to gain the office, and if he did, would it be possible for him to do anything that was not on the script. But we do now know that at least as of Donald Trump's election, there was some ability to use that system to gain power. The game in the US is that all of the useful candidates are eliminated in the primaries so that you don't have anything valid to vote for in the general election. That's the game. Then we have a bunch of people who've recognized that game, who are sophisticated enough to know that it doesn't matter, what they do doesn't matter, and so they've stopped voting, which is a terrible error, because now those people are indistinguishable from the ones who don't care enough or don't know enough to know who to pick in the first place. So the apathetic have gotten mixed in with the disaffected, and this is a terrible error. The disaffected should make it very clear that there are a huge number of votes ready to go to somebody who articulates a vision, right? Voting for something other than the major party candidates is a powerful move, and they are leaving that power on the table. So, as you know, Raven, all of these things, if you stop looking at the details of who it is who's talking and what they're saying, these are games in the sense of game theory. And there are often opportunities that we have and do not avail ourselves of because we don't think game theoretically. We get too involved in the narrative that we're being told to focus on. So I don't know how you get it to happen, but getting people to zoom out, to understand that they have adversaries, that is to say, you have people using this system for private gain who are not public-spirited, who are not patriotic, and figuring out how to outfox them by behaving in ways that are not anticipated. Donald Trump worked because he was not anticipated. He was too absurd to attain office, and so he was in fact fueled by the Clinton campaign, who thought he was the ideal opponent, right? That was a move that was not anticipated, and so it worked. And likewise, somebody mentioned COVID. I would say the same dynamic unfolded where you had very powerful entities that had complete control over all of the major broadcast media. They had influence over the universities. They had influence over the scientific journals. They didn't worry at all that they couldn't distribute a narrative and have us all believe it, because how would we possibly do anything else? They literally didn't know what a podcast was. They didn't know why it should matter. And so suddenly people are sitting with Joe Rogan, some fighter, and they're having conversations about details of the immune system. And still, the people who are selling us this garbage narrative can't imagine why do they need to pay attention? And the fact is they needed to pay attention because this was the mechanism that we used. We stepped outside of their system and had the conversations that they knew they could prevent inside the system. So once again, you need to stay in territory where they don't anticipate you, right? And that may look like Joe Rogan's man cave, which is just fine, right? That's perfect place if it's got to be there. That's like a speakeasy. So anyway, do what isn't anticipated, and you'll be far better off than if you go exactly where they expect you.
Yeah, the gentleman right here is.
I'm really glad that you found sanity and functioning institutions here, because I was struggling to find any of that during the COVID. So was not so unsimilar, but I was even struggling to find like-minded people around me. I was kind of going to lose my plot because it was too much. Then I found your podcast and some others that came me keep sanity, and I especially enjoyed not only that I agreed with most of what you had to say, but I liked the way you approached that, very moderate talk, very modest approach to problems. Even if you find some dispute with somebody that was engaged with some kindness and trying to get to the bottom of the problem rather than yelling and ranting. So that was very appreciated. And you also admitted uncertainty about things in biology. There is always uncertainty, and that was important for me to that we acknowledge that. But at that point, I realized that you were quite positive, quite confident about ivermectin. I know nobody cares anymore because it's no point. I'd like to bring it back. When I saw the FLCCA meta-analysis about ivermectin, I was excited as everybody. Then the Together trial came, and I just put it back, and I was really struggling to find a way, and I saw that you were quite confident, and people like Alex Berenson, they were strictly against, and many others actually. So I would like to ask, what made you so confident, or maybe unusually confident about it? And if you ever tried to reconcile maybe with Alex Berenson or others that were really strictly against this, to reconcile your source of wisdom and your if you ever try to really talk about it, wisdom, or if not, then why?
So I'm going to take an approach to this question that I've never taken before. Maybe this time it will get through. We'll see. It's an experiment. If Heather and I were to acknowledge that we got it wrong on ivermectin, everybody would breathe a huge sigh of relief, or almost everybody. And we would be in a much better situation, right? The degree to which we pay a cost for our position on ivermectin is extreme, and it continues to be. So you should be asking yourself the question, if you know that people would say, actually, you did the honorable thing, you got it wrong, we all make mistakes, you explained how the mistake happened, we appreciate that. We know that that would elevate our capacity to function in the world. The reason we don't do it is that the stuff that you know that we got right by sticking to our guns when we knew that the evidence supported our conclusion, even when the pressure was incredible for us to change our tune. So what I'm telling you is the evidence on ivermectin is utterly unambiguous. And I would say, if that sounds strange to you, didn't we settle it? The Together trial, the Active 6 trial, we have how many big randomized controlled trials that tell us that ivermectin doesn't work? Why would you, that's the answer. That's how we do it in science. We run a big trial, it tells us what the answer is, and we move on. Why are you staring down these trials? Because they were fraudulent. And you can see the fraud in the trials. The trick is pharma decides to narrow the scope of evidence so that the only thing that counts is a randomized controlled trial. Already, that is cheating. Randomized controlled trials are the kind of thing that is so expensive that only an entity with a tremendous amount of money can run one. Now, once you have control to run one, we run into the next problem, which is that randomized controlled trials are fantastic in one way and one way only, which is that when you have a subtle process, a randomized controlled trial can bring the signal out of the noise so you see it clearly. But they are fantastically gameable. That is to say, if you know what result you want from a randomized controlled trial and you have power over how the trial is run, it is very easy to arrange a false result. Now, I would point you to a couple of sources of real insight on this. One of them is Pierre Corey's book, The War on Ivermectin. If you want to look at how these trials were rigged, you can see an analysis of all of the techniques that were used inside of the trials, coupled with all of the techniques that were used to propagandize the public on this subject, right? It is entirely unambiguous. And let me point to one of a dozen different tricks that were employed. Trials underdosed. This is a way that pharma makes a competing drug look non-functional. You underdose. So, you know, if you had a person who was dying of thirst and you gave them a thimbleful of water and they died anyway, and you said water is not the cure for thirst, right? That's the trick. So in this case, we know ivermectin is always dosed by body weight. We also know that COVID is increasingly dangerous the heavier you are, right? So the most at-risk people, the people liable to show up in these trials as having gone to the hospital or died, are liable to be the people who were overweight. What they did in the trials is, for no reason that has ever been explained, they capped the dosage so that people who were overweight were all systematically underdosed, whereas people who were at a normal weight got a proportional dose the way they were supposed to. It took weeks to figure out how this was done. So what you got was headline, randomized controlled trial, largest one ever run, ivermectin doesn't work, right? 2 weeks later, we understand, oh, here are the 6 ways that this trial was sabotaged. It was set up to fail. And then here's the punchline to the joke. All of the trials, the large randomized controlled trials that are used to prove that ivermectin doesn't work, if you ignore the analysis that the trial provides and you look at the evidence in the trial, ivermectin worked in every single one of them, right? So you have trials in which even the sabotage of ivermectin was unsuccessful because it's that effective against COVID. So why don't we reverse course? Why don't we reconcile with Alex Berenson? Because Alex Berenson's wrong. He just simply is. And I don't know that the world is ever going to figure this out. I don't know that we won't continue to pay a price for the rest of our days as if we are ignoring the evidence and, you know, are too proud to admit we got it wrong. But there is no day of the week where we wouldn't be better off if we simply did that and allowed the public to forgive us and, you know, congratulate us for being, I don't know, good people. But ivermectin works, or at least it did work up until now. Viruses change. We'll see about what's going forward. But those randomized controlled trials were standard pharma tricks being deployed in a place where the public wasn't prepared to discount their trickery.
All right. Yeah.
Hello. So you mentioned a couple of times that we have something special somewhere here, whether it's in Europe, Czech Republic, Prague, whatever. And I was wondering if you also mentioned your podcast, Joe Rogan, and so on. And through that, and obviously the influence of Hollywood movies and so on, all of the people here understand every word you say, even though it's none of our language. And I was wondering if you think it's possible that one of the things that's protecting us from those dangerous ideologies from the West is our language, which, by the way, I'm not sure if you're aware of this, is one of the most complicated in the world.
This has been on our minds as a component, and I don't think we too don't know enough about this to really have a good sense. But my guess is a couple of things are in play. One, the idea that the Czech language is just isolating because nobody else speaks it has caused a tremendous amount of bilingualism. And bilingualism is in and of itself an enhancer of consciousness. Just the fact of translating between two tongues is something that will force you into your conscious mind in the same way, oddly, that if you write poetry, you will find that it activates your conscious mind. Because, you know, I don't say this about free verse, but if you write poetry where you have rhyme and meter, it's so constrained that in order to find a word that is close enough to your meaning that you can generate a line that makes sense of what you're constantly coming at things from the wrong angle, and it makes you think about the analytics of whatever you're talking about in a much deeper way. Likewise, translating between languages does the same thing, and there's probably also something to the idea that the isolation of your language causes a greater degree to the extent that there is a Czech mind, that there are concepts which are resonant within Czech culture that are being actively discussed, right, it probably causes a greater refinement of that process. Whereas if you're talking about something in the English-speaking world, you're talking across so many different cultures that every word is a blunt instrument because it's being used in many different ways that have different connotations. So I don't exactly know what the input is, but I think you're on the right track thinking that the Czech language has some positive influence in and of itself.
Yeah, I think there's something about the borders of a language effectively constraining you positively such that you can grow. Whereas English spreads, it's like a missionary language at this point, right? And it spreads and it seeks more power. And I don't think that Czech speakers imagine that you're going to start spreading Czech into other parts of the West.
We used to think
yeah.
that.
I mean, I think we are very much early in the slope of our learning about the Czech Republic and the history, but we've been talking with Adam a lot in the last few days, and there's some relevant stuff about your founding president with regard to how he understood, how he placed the Czechoslovakia then as, was it a meta-nation? Is that the, did I make that up?
Well, he said that the Czech question is this is a direct quote, that the Czech question is the question about the fate of humanity, essentially, and that we had a historical mission. It's a strange thing how it sort of came back in our conversations on Friday.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Well, I think there's something else. Someone else was telling us about his imagining of the Czech people and the Czech place. I mean, everyone imagines that they are the people, right? This is sort of a universal. But imagining that you are the people at the same time that you see yourself constantly come at, and constantly, actually, over time, successful and resistant and able to hold on to the flame even as many would have you quench it, has got to be ultimately empowering, even as it feels like the opposite. Even as you see we in the West, as you say, just taking over the world with our vacuous entertainment and trying to force it on all of you. We didn't have any hard times since World War II, and even that was remote in the U.S. anyway. The West. Right? There has not been a war fought on our soil since before the Industrial Revolution, and that was a civil war. So we haven't known what it actually means to be under threat in the same way in forever, and that has meant that we are more confused about what danger really looks like.
Hello. Pavel stole my meme about hobbits. I actually wanted to answer with the same story about hobbits who saved Middle-earth. But generally, I would, if I can contribute to this discussion, we were constantly oppressed by someone in last 1,000 years. So there was a huge struggle with Germany for all our history. And then we have 300s under Habsburgs, which without our own state, but we then found it again. And then there was a communism. So I would say that partially our conservatism and kind of attitude against big changes are rooted in that, not only in communism. Hobbits comparison is quite good. I would say it's funny, but it's quite good actually. But to the question, probably most of the people here know your history, how you have struggled with your career, struggled probably because of your positions and opinions. So I would like to ask you, how are you doing now? How is your career? I would say the book is selling pretty well in the US, I heard, but regarding the academic career or your general life with your opinions, because if you think that everything's fine here, our government is working pretty hard to catch up with the West, I would say. And I'm a publicly known person, outspoken as well, and I'm feeling every day very similar things as you probably did. A little bit less, but it's already present here as well.
Well, I'm sorry to hear that it's present here, but I'm not surprised. I would still just say the degree of difference is what's so important. Even just seeing, I mean, I can't tell you, this is so strange that Heather and I were just watching, you're not going to believe this, families with children, some of them in strollers, just one after the other up and down the street. This isn't what one sees in the US at the moment. In fact, there's a decided hostility to the idea of having children, to the idea of marriage, to the idea of romance. It's such a bizarre place to have landed that normalcy is now radical. So anyway, I'm sure it's here, but to a lesser degree. How are we? That is a tough question, my friend. No, people ask, I don't know what to tell you. Things are dark, but there are possibilities open that have not been opened in our lifetimes. That's a good thing. How are we doing? Well, we beat the force called Goliath on COVID. That was pretty great. But it has radically interfered with our ability to earn, to provide safety for our own children. It has succeeded on a front that you can't really see. On the other hand, we wake up every day faced with too many opportunities to partner with people, to have really important conversations, to do something useful in the world. We are literally burdened by the amount of meaning that might be made and not being able to divide our time well enough to do it properly. We are burdened with the complexity of the lives that were created by being ejected from the academy, where our lives were simple because we had one employer and the deal was negotiated once and a paycheck came and there was insurance and it was just as simple as it could possibly be. And now somehow we're entrepreneurs, even though neither of us ever wanted to be. So life is complex. It is not intuitive. It is a gift to have the opportunity to talk to people who are really interested in making a difference. And I guess the one last thing I would say is there's a process that I call the painful upgrade. Every time we have stood up, we have seen the same pattern. We have lost people that we thought had courage and integrity, and they have disappointed us mightily. But we have gained people that we had no idea existed, who were even stronger. People have shown up in our lives, and they've brought strength of character that is almost unimaginable. And the simple fact of having conversations daily with this group of highly courageous, insightful, decent people, many of whom have lost job after job over taking the correct stance on the public's behalf. It's an honor to just simply have those people as friends. So I don't know what the answer to your question is, but I guess I wouldn't change anything.
I agree with everything you just said, and I think this is just a brief reframing, which is that we had really great jobs and a great life where we were raising our children in the forest. And we could bike through the forest to our offices at a college that was amazing. And we had tenure, so we had jobs for life. But it was a fiction. And so the fact that it blew up was extraordinarily difficult and impossible to believe as it happened. And for months, maybe years afterwards, at least months. And we dealt with it somewhat differently, but together throughout, and that's part of what made it possible. But very quickly, I mean, there was never any question. You stand up to the monster when it shows up on your doorstep. You don't nod and say, yes, you're right. Up is down, black is white, 2 and 2 is 5. You don't do that. So there was never any question about, did we do the right thing, standing up? But it seemed there was grief. But ultimately, it became actually a question of, given that that was a fiction that we were living, I'd far rather know. And early, within a few weeks of the riots at Evergreen, our sons were then, gosh, they would have been like 9 and 11. And our 9-year-old turned to us and said, "Are we going to become homeless?" And I thought, he has no, like, we're lucky. We actually are privileged. You know, we are not in a position where we were going to end up on the streets. We're 2 college professors. That wasn't the position we were in, but he didn't know that. So I was furious with them, not my children, but them, for raising that question in my children's minds at that point. But I thought, okay, no, we're not, this can't take that from us. This can't take a level of security that actually matters most deeply. And given all of that, the amazing life that we thought we had at this amazing school wasn't what it seemed, so I'd far rather know. We went, one of the phrases we started using was borrowing from Lewis Carroll, through the looking glass. So we went through the looking glass and we looked back to the other side and said, oh, okay, well, I don't know what we're going to build. I don't know what comes next, but it's far better to know.
I think there's one other thing that needs to be said on this front, which is Heather's right. We were living a fiction and we didn't know it, and it is in its own way a gift to know that the people that you think would stand up for you don't. But there were those who did, and the interesting pattern, there were a tiny number of people on the faculty, and there were a tiny number of people on the staff. But the people who came through were our students. Now, this is a little bit invisible because the way the story got recorded historically, it looks like students rebelled against professor. Those weren't our students. We'd never met those people. Okay? Our students didn't do that because what we were doing in the classroom, that was not a fiction, right? That was a real community of people who, including us, I'm not saying they were getting something from this. We were all getting something from it, and it was so real that not a one of them switched sides, even though at the moment, you know, it's exciting, there's a protest against professors, you know, it was a witch hunt. And I'm quite certain that the people who arranged it expected our students to jump on board, because who wants to be on the wrong end of a witch hunt, right? That doesn't sound like a good idea, but they didn't, right? They didn't because they knew the truth, because the community of people that we had around us at the student level was real, and the number of those people who stood up, including students of color, who stood up on our behalf, really, it reified that portion of it to a great degree, and I'm proud of them for doing that, and I feel honored by their willingness to do it. So the fiction was in the institutional layer. It was our so-called colleagues. It was not the student-faculty relationship in our classroom. That was real.
All right, the gentleman over there, and now, by the way, we've just crossed the 2-hour mark, so how are you feeling? Is it okay to continue? Yeah, all right, well, let's carry on.
Hello, yeah, I would rather speak in Czech, be more comfortable for me, thanks. Já mám otázku vlastně trošku upřesňující k té předchozí. A sice já si představuji, že během tady toho exponovaného času těch posledních pár let jste byli pod obrovským tlakem a mě by zajímalo, jak jste si udrželi psychický zdraví, nebo jak jste to vydrželi, když to řeknu úplně nejjednodušším způsobem. A jestli byste dokázali třeba popsat nějaký mechanismus nebo metodu, jak jste ověřili, že jste pořád v kontaktu s realitou třeba, jo? Že jste se neuzavřeli do nějaký bubliny nějakého sebeklamu, nebo tak, děkuji.
All right, so over the past several years, you must have been under tremendous pressure, and the question is, how have you maintained your mental health, and stayed insane, and how have you managed to stay in contact with reality? Right, that's is that.
We have talked a lot about this on the podcast. We are concerned about young people whose relationships, if you dispense with something like romance, so that you don't necessarily have a person in your life who is in some way more fundamental than the outside world, then when the world goes insane, you don't have a reality check where somebody has an obligation to you that is higher than their obligation to the outsiders. So we were lucky, right? We had a family dinner table at which we could simply try to make sense of the world. We were lucky to have those human relationships, that they were rock solid, and that they were dependable in a way that almost defies language. We also were lucky to have scientific tools that were appropriate to the exact questions of COVID, so that we could begin to bootstrap a first principles style understanding of what was going on. And in fact, the story of Dark Horse, which before COVID was really, it was me talking to people who were unusual about how they accomplished the things that they were doing. It became what it was because Heather said, we're having these conversations every night about COVID. I think people need to hear this. They need to know how to think about this. Why don't we just turn on the camera and talk, right? So these things combined to keep us sane. And the fact that it also nucleated the emergence of a group of people who were similarly interested in working from first principles and sorting out the details of what was going on meant that even if the outer world was crazy, an inner world was forming in which there were people, to the extent that there were questions here that centered on the functionality of the heart. Well, let's call Peter McCullough, see what he says, right? To the extent that there were questions about the mRNA technology, I don't know, Robert Malone would be the guy. So the ability to just simply talk to people who knew things, knew how to think, had courage, and to have each other was enough to remain sane as the world around went into what clearly was some kind of psychosis.
Well, I think the one piece that you didn't mention that we both relied on a lot in order to retain mental health to the degree that we did so was engaging in physical activity outdoors. Bicycling, kayaking, paddleboarding, hiking, more, I imagine, but those are the four big things that we happen to engage in. And just putting yourself in positions in nature, or just even on the streets of the city. We were living in Portland, Oregon, until very recently, where you can both be surprised by what the world throws at you, and get your heart rate up, and climb the hill, get through, paddle up river, whatever it is clarifying. And where I understand that there is distinctly a culture of hiking here in the Czech Republic. Maybe it's just Prague. I've heard that certainly from Eva, wherever she is, but from other people as well. And I think that may also help explain, I don't know, from whence that cultural piece comes, but that may also explain how, to the extent that you are holding on to some of the flame of the West, that you're reminding yourself that it's not all about what's going on in your head, that you're getting outside and seeing some of the world that actually doesn't depend on you. And if we all disappear, it continues. And being reminded of that as often as possible is really clarifying.
I have one other thing I want to add. There is an addendum in the book which has gotten no attention. We didn't know exactly what to do. We finished the first draft of the book, and literally as we emerged from the Amazon where we completed that first draft, the first inkling that there was some disease that was being discussed came onto our phones as they came alive. So we were already effectively done with the book, but there was a question about whether to introduce COVID, and the decision was it's not a good idea. It's not what the book is about, and it will cause people to see the book in a particular way. So we left everything about COVID in this one little section. But the section says something important. It describes a thought experiment. One of our big early successes on Dark Horse was the point, which I think started with us and spread, people caught on, that there was something wrong with the idea that we were being told, don't go outside, the beaches are closed, the skate parks are closed, you're not allowed to go hiking. This was perfectly insane. right? This was the opposite of the right advice. And what turned out to be the pattern over COVID was that everything you were told was closer to the opposite of the right advice than it was to good advice. So in this last section about COVID, we talk about the idea that with a disease that does not transmit outside, a species that evolved outside couldn't manage to arrange 2 weeks outside, because if it had, we could have put the whole thing to rest. We could have driven it extinct, right? Obviously, there's no way you could get 8 billion people to all go outside for 2 weeks, but at the level of the thought experiment, just simply even knowing that here's what they never told you, right? Don't panic. The disease, it has its dangers, but you can do anything you would normally do outside. Is this getting in the way of falling in love, of having friendships, of having concerts? Just do it outside. Figure out how to do it outside. We have I don't know, an aphorism in the Pacific Northwest where it's very wet. I bet it's even more appropriate here. There is no bad weather, only inappropriate equipment, right? So if people had taken that approach, humanity could have said, isn't this weird that we're now stuck doing everything outside, but isn't it great that COVID didn't cause us to lose our humanity and go after each other? That would have just been a better way to approach it. And we missed that opportunity because, I don't know, because we were told to do exactly the opposite of the right thing.
Right, we've one question right at the front.
Hello. First of all, thank you for your work, and thank you for coming to Prague. My question is about conspiracy theories. So get your tinfoil hats on. I listened to your brother Eric on a podcast that he did just a few weeks ago, when he talked about quite extensively, although with no specific certainty, about the quote-unquote elite, this very wealthy, very powerful group or groups of people that influence the whole world on a global scale, economically, politically, and socially. So my question is, firstly, do you believe in this elite as well? And secondly, if you do, how do they play a role in the situation that we find ourselves in today? Thank you.
The trick is figuring out how to think about whatever force it is that is, you know, driving us crazy, causing us to go after each other rather than unite in a common direction, without making assumptions that are meaningfully false. I don't know if there is a cabal, but there are many cabals. During COVID, we actually discovered the names of many of them. The Trusted News Initiative, right? We know that there are institutes at Stanford that study what they call the spread of misinformation, that are actually about systematically censoring people who are trying to spread information that is contrary to the official narrative. So there are lots of entities which, however they came to be, are conspiring against exactly the processes that we would need in order to navigate in an intelligent way. But we don't know the details of what's driving. We still don't know what the meaning of Epstein's Island was. How many people are being controlled and are doing something that they would not have chosen to do because there's compromise on them somewhere, right? That could potentially put a large number of people under the control of some entity whose name we don't know. We don't know who they are. We don't know how big a role this is playing in our modern systems. So what I would advise is, and I think everybody who thinks deeply about these questions has their own version of this, but for us, we talk about Goliath, right? Goliath is the force that opposes meaningful change. If you're at the top of the hierarchy, meaningful change is a threat because you can't go up and you can go down. So change threatens to reduce your position in a way that is frightening. So Goliath is the force that opposes meaningful change. Some of that is likely to be people conspiring against dangerous processes like, for example, democracy, right? And some of it is liable to be emergent properties where people who don't know who they're working for or why, discover that if they put certain ideas into public, that they suddenly find themselves richer than they were, right? They're effectively being paid by people they will never meet. So you have emergent properties, and you have presumably cabals of people choosing to do something. We don't know how much of each thing we've got. It's some ratio, and we don't know it. So by just saying, look, there is a force, let's call it Goliath. You could call it Leviathan, right? There are many names for it. But it tells us something about how to fight back, even though you can't name the details of what's inside it. And the key lesson of the model of Goliath is that Goliath, once upon a time, was actually a real guy, right? He was, as far as we understand, a pituitary tumor giant. He was somebody whose pituitary gland had a tumor. He grew larger than he should have been, and he was also a psychopath and was terrorizing people. And his killer was not David. That was Edit in the biblical story. His killer was a guy named Elhanan. But the idea that at one time Goliath was a real person and Elhanan was a real person. At this moment, Goliath is now some large conglomerate of things. Elhanan is not going to be a person either. Elhanan is going to be a conglomeration of things. And what we can know is that because Goliath contains this emergent property, when I say it's emergent, that's a synonym here for evolved. Because Goliath has components that evolved rather than are a group of people sitting around a conference room, that you can actually beat Goliath by pulling him onto territory he doesn't know. Because evolved phenomena are very powerful when they are in the habitats where they evolved, and they are very feeble when they are in places that are unfamiliar. This is why the podcast was able to overcome the official COVID narrative, because the podcast was unfamiliar territory. Goliath didn't know what to do about it, and he fumbled. So all I would say is, if you are trying to figure out how we are going to beat some powerful force composed partially of people whose names we don't know in organizations we haven't spotted, the answer is bring them onto territory that they know nothing about, and then let their own feebleness and clumsiness defeat them.
All right, we should have one last question, and then get some wine and perhaps some books signed, because, yeah. Well, we have the gentleman over here. If there's, I would like to give opportunity to somebody who hasn't asked a question, but if we have a, okay, we have a sole contender, so.
Thank you. I would go back to the problem of the capture of the institutions and what comes from the West. By the way, I think part of our resilience is that some of the propaganda and the shaming are too much similar to what was here in the previous regime during the communism, and a lot of people are not missing that. And in that time, there was a quite well-known essay that was called Parallel Polis by Václav Benda, and the premise is that if you cannot beat the regime in capture of those existing institutions, you can create parallel ones. And it seems that we are having some of them, like podcasts, whether Americans like yours, or we have ours as well. We also have some groups of people that come together, if not just for like moral uplifting of each other. What would you say are the most crucially missing alternative institutions? What could people without some deep specialization focus on creating to challenge those captured institutions?
It's funny because I posted a picture of Václav Havel's grave with no explanation, just as sort of a beacon that there was something about Havel that is important to the idea of the West and to the idea of this place that is different. And one of the other COVID dissidents, Erin Cariati, responded, "Don't forget Václav Benda," which of course I didn't know what he was talking about, and we had a conversation yesterday and I learned this very lesson. So yes, that is resonant. It is resonant in the campfire conversation that is emerging. You are 100% right. The right thing to do, you can't rescue these institutions, but you can build the parallel ones, as Benda apparently suggested, and presumably, at some point, if we come to our senses, all of the materials necessary to re-infuse the institutions with something vital is there. I mean, the buildings are there, the libraries are there, right? So if you build the stuff in parallel, we have the infrastructure, we just don't have access to it at the moment. And that's an extremely powerful potential. But let me point out one last thing. The process that Goliath, for lack of a better term, has been using has taken all of the best people and it has shoved them out of the institutions, right? It drove them out of the military, it drove them out of the police forces, it drove them out of government, it drove them out of the academy, it drove them out of everything, which means that all of the people who have the integrity and the insight that they couldn't take it in those corrupt regimes are now on the outside. So what I believe happened is Goliath created the ultimate opposing force. He created the ultimate Elhanan or David to fight him in the form of all of these people who have, you know, the skills and the insight to accomplish what institutions do and have now been confronted by this unholy force. So, you know, I don't love our odds at the level of the amount of power. I don't love how much the internet knows about us and we know nothing about who has access to this information and in what ways they use it. That asymmetry is bad. But the asymmetry of having all of the best people on our team and, you know, pissed off and ready to go, that's pretty good, right? That's the stuff of legend. So do realize the dream team is out there and it's time, right? We know it's time.
So ladies and gents, once again, thank you for the guests, Heather Heyingové, Bret Weinsteina.